Hello and welcome back to Oxford at Home. My name is Fernando. I teach Chinese history and politics here at Oxford University, but my role here today is to host yet another in our fantastic series of Oxford at Home talks, which showcase the research, teaching and thinking that's going on here at the university, even while we're in what we all profoundly hope are the last few weeks of the UK's national lockdown during the coronavirus pandemic. And today, at a moment when many of us are still confined to our homes, it's great to have a talk that's going to set our horizons going not just beyond our own houses, but actually beyond our own planet. You may be aware that a few years ago, in 2018, in fact, NASA's InSight mission landed on the surface of Mars, marking the first deployment of a seismometer on the red planet in 42 years. And today, to tell us about that, we have the physicist Ben Fernando. Now, he works at the Department of Earth Sciences in Oxford, and he is going to be telling us a great deal about the present and indeed the future of what's happening with seismology on Mars. So as I say, Ben is a physicist. He's working in Oxford's Seismology and Stellar Evolution group, and recently he's been part of NASA's InSight team working on their Perseverance rover project. Just to be clear, InSight detects seismic activity, or Marsquakes, not earthquakes, obviously, to help scientists understand better the interior structure of that planet. And although there have been hundreds of them detected since the landing of the probe in 2018, there haven't been any impact events such as meteorites hitting the surface detected. So the arrival of Perseverance rover offered the first opportunity to detect a known planned landing of a foreign body on the surface of the planet, and that could provide tremendous amounts of evidence. We should say that Ben's research has been recognized very widely. Just recently, he was awarded the Westminster Medal at the STEM for Britain Awards, STEM as in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, STEM for Britain Awards 2021. And just to say, the Westminster Medal is awarded to the best of the 5 gold medalists that are awarded in particular categories. So it really is, you know, the kind of ultimate accolade in that particular field. Ben has said of Perseverance that, quotes, "This is an incredibly exciting experiment." I think we all feel the same way. So we're going to be just handing over in a moment. Just a reminder, you can send your questions through your various platforms in the chat function, and they'll be passed on to me to ask Ben. He'll speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about a quarter of an hour or so for questions afterwards. Don't forget that we are still at home. We're still working off our home Wi-Fi. So if there's a sudden brownout for a few seconds, bear with us and we'll try and come back. But now I think time to stretch to not just what's on Mars, but what's under Mars. Ben, could I hand over to you?
Wonderful. Thank you, Rana, for having me today. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to all of you at what's a really exciting time in Mars research. So although I'm giving today's talk, I would say this has been an enormous team effort. InSight's a mission which has been under development and now under operation for well over 10 years with partners from the US, the UK, France and Germany. It's been funded by the UK Space Agency in part, and that they're supporting my contribution. So thank you to everyone who's contributed to this, and please bear that in mind. I haven't done all this on my own. It's very much a team effort. So why are we doing this? Why do we spend money on trying to understand what the surface of Mars is like and what's under Mars? I like to start with this picture. The picture on the left, I'm sure you're familiar with. It's one of the most famous pictures of the Earth ever taken. The picture on the right is Mars, but seen from Earth. Sometimes when I'm giving this talk to primary school kids, I ask them to point out what they think is the biggest difference between the two. And it's obvious. One's blue and one's red. That's actually quite fundamental. Why is Earth blue and Mars red? Well, Earth is blue because it has oceans. Why does Mars not have oceans anymore? Mars is red because there's an enormous amount of oxygen locked up in the iron from the soil that's basically rusted the entire planet. Why does Mars not really have much of an atmosphere anymore, but Earth does? Those sorts of questions can't just be answered by taking pictures of the surface. We need to look much deeper, for example, understanding how Mars's magnetic field and losing it may have contributed to the atmosphere being enormously eroded over the last few billion years. The only way that we can really look below the surface at a whole variety of scales and resolutions is through a technique called seismology. The basic principle of seismology, at least on Earth, is that you have an earthquake, and it produces what we call seismic waves that propagate through the planet. We detect those seismic waves at different points on the Earth's surface, and different seismic waves move in different ways through the planet. Some, for example, don't go through the core. Some stay in the crust. And over time, you can detect lots of these seismic waves and use them to build up a picture of both what the interior of the planet is like. And that's one way that we know, for example, that the Earth's outer core is liquid, but also to study the earthquake that produced those waves. So you can study both what we call the structure of the planet and the properties of the source, which in most cases on Earth is an earthquake. On Mars, we call it a Marsquake. Well, doing seismology on Earth is all well and good, but to do seismology on Mars, you have to get there first. And that's where InSight comes in. So it's a Discovery class NASA mission, which was the product of many years of development. The last time a seismometer landed on Mars was 1976. InSight landed in 2018, so 42 years later. This is a picture from the launch in May of 2018, about 4 o'clock in the morning US time. And you can see it blasting away on its rocket from the coast of California on its journey to Mars. This is a selfie that InSight took a couple of years ago. And this is on the surface of Mars. So there's a few things I'd like to point out. You can see the enormous solar panels. That orange box there, that's the seismometer, which we lift off the surface of the lander and put on the surface of the planet. And we cover it with the wind and thermal shield, which is the silver box behind it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Before we move on, I just want to focus your attention on the little blue tether leading from the bottom corner of the orange box to the black square in the image, which is where the instrument arm is. Let's zoom in on that. Some of you might recognize that there. That's actually the University of Oxford logo. And by my estimation, it's the most distant University of Oxford logo still in existence. As of this morning, it's about 236 million kilometers away. And at the speed of light, it would take you 13 minutes to get there. So I quite like that. I think it's kind of cool. These are the short period seismometers. So these were the British contribution to the mission. They were built at Imperial College in London and tested at the University of Oxford. And the way that they work is they exert an electrical current on the seismometer. So when the spacecraft shakes, you try and keep the balance, the mass in the center, the silvery white bit stationary. And the amount of current required to stop that mass moving tells you how much the spacecraft is shaking. And we can use that to record seismic events like earthquakes or Marsquakes. The trouble is that Mars is a very tricky place to work. So InSight doesn't record weather anymore because we don't have enough power, but Curiosity, which is another NASA mission, is quite close by. This is the weather postcast for earlier last week. And you'll see that it's pretty extreme. The high on the 3rd of March was -14 centigrade. The low was -73. It's pretty cold, pretty chilly, and that's not as bad as it gets sometimes. So that's why we have to have the wind shield on top of the instrument to stop the wind that's produced by these enormous temperature variations shaking the spacecraft, and to ensure that it's not affected by the enormous thermal variations that we see over the course of the day. These are some plots of data from Mars. So on the top, you see a Marsquake. On the bottom, you see a plot of the noise. That's what we record on the instrument when there are no Marsquakes happening. They're very different to what we see on Earth. The Marsquakes go on for a very long time, unlike earthquakes, and the noise changes in its behavior through the course of the day. These are two very unusual things that are entirely dissimilar to what we see on Earth. So what we're doing now is trying to understand what makes these signals the way that they are. Where does Perseverance come into this? Well, here's a picture of Perseverance that I took at JPL, that's one of the NASA labs in California in January of last year. On Mars, we have lots of Marsquakes, but we can't do what's called triangulation. We can't detect the same seismic waves at different positions and use them to work out where the earthquake happened or the Marsquake happened, because we've only got one instrument. So to calibrate them, we tried to find an event where we knew exactly how big, when, and where it was going to happen. And we could use that to calibrate our models of Mars's interior to make sure that the measurements we're making are correct. Events where we know how big, where, and how when they're going to happen are pretty rare on Mars. But we realized that the landing of Perseverance would be one of those events. It involves dissipating so much energy when the spacecraft comes into land that there was a possibility that we would be able to detect it at InSight. So we did a series of modeling experiments to figure out how to set up the instruments on InSight to try and detect the landing of Perseverance, which happened earlier last month on the 18th of February. And that was a really exciting thing to be involved in, working with the NASA teams across multiple missions. That's been a really brief introduction to my work about why it's important to do seismology, what that can teach us, and how we've been able to do one of the first experiments of this kind anywhere other than on the Earth. This is the first time that we've ever tried to detect one spacecraft arriving at Mars using another, and the results have the potential to be incredibly exciting, and it's a very cool thing to be working on. That's all I've got to say for now, but I look forward to taking some of your questions. Thank you.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. That was, although it was concise, it was packed with all sorts of really intriguing possibilities. And I see that our question function is already beginning to really, bubble up with all sorts of different ideas. Could I start there by asking a few things? I mean, I think probably like many people, I've always been fascinated by Mars without having anything like even, a tiny proportion of the expertise that you have there as well. Could you take us through some of the changes in the way that we've understood Mars in perhaps, the lifetimes of some of us? You're far too young, of course, but, say over the last 30 or 40 years, there have been certainly variations in the way in which people have understood not just what the surface of Mars is like, but what its composition is. So how has our knowledge advanced on Mars, let's say in the last, quarter of a century or so?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's important to bear in mind that the first pictures of Mars from space only came in the 1960s, the end of the 1960s. Until that point, there were still people theorizing that some of the dark lines on Mars were canals that some intelligent civilization had built to take water from the frozen poles to the desolate equator, and that there was this enormous group of Martians who were waiting there to welcome us.
And just to check, you're absolutely sure that's not the case?
It looks like it's probably not the case, I'm afraid. Whether there's life on Mars or there was in the past is still very much an open question in research, but we can say for sure that there are no big artificial canals on Mars. It's not.
But actually, just on that, Ben, I mean, I resisted from actually asking the life on Mars questions, but since you brought it up, we've gone from perhaps, I got the impression 10, 20 years ago, people were saying, look, really, there isn't life on Mars, and there hasn't been. And now we're back to a place where we're saying, well, maybe.
So attitudes to this have very much changed, and in many ways they've been informed by discoveries of life in unusual places elsewhere on Earth. So we've seen life that exists on Earth in radioactive waste piles, at the bottom of the ocean in hydrothermal vents, in incredibly acidic alkaline environments, or on volcanoes, places that 50 years ago we would never have expected to find life. And that has changed some of our perceptions about where life might exist. So it's not a foregone conclusion that there's no life on Mars today. But what's almost a more exciting prospect is that there was life on Mars at some point in the past. And that's exciting because once we found it in two places in the universe, it means it's highly unlikely that it isn't existing anywhere else.
But I interrupted you. So you're just telling us the kind of wider trajectory of how understanding has changed and developed. Please do go on.
So there was the thing to emphasize is that getting to Mars is really hard. I think with Perseverance's landing, the success rate has just crossed from being less than 50% to more than 50%. So other than the images of the surface and then the Viking probes, which landed in the 70s, it was a long time until we started doing landers and rovers again on Mars. And InSight's, one of less than 10 missions that's ever successfully landed there. It's enormously changed the way that we think about the planet. It's clear it's not like Earth. It doesn't have oceans anymore. It's tectonically dead today. But it clearly had oceans and a thick atmosphere and volcanoes at some point in the past. Exactly why those things stopped being the way that they are, when they became the way that they are today and stopped being active in the past, is an outstanding question that we still need to do more research on. And that's one of the things that InSight is trying to do. It's very much it, along with the other NASA missions and, of course, international orbiters around Mars now. You'll see the Chinese Tianwen mission and the UAE's HOPE mission recently entered orbit, are trying to understand how Mars has changed. So, as you said, we've changed our perceptions enormously in the last 50 years of how Mars is, and I'm sure that will continue to happen.
What would something, I mean, is Olympus Mons, in fact, a volcano in the sense that we would understand that on Earth? And, can one imagine a sort of Martian surface in which you suddenly have kind of lava flowing out in a way that's familiar to us from our own planet? Or should we understand it in a rather different sort of way?
It's not a bad way of understanding it at all. So it's important to note that Olympus Mons is not like Mount Etna or some of these mountains that you'd see on TV. And it probably never was enormously eruptive, throwing these enormous columns of ash into the sky. It was in the past probably a lot more like Mauna Kea or Mauna Loa in Hawaii. So it's a shield volcano. It is incredibly high. It's about 27 kilometers, so much, much taller than Mount Everest. but it's also sort of 600, 700 kilometers across. If you were on Olympus Mons, you might not realize that you're on a volcano because it stretches beyond the horizon. Once upon a time, it was clearly emitting lava onto the Martian surface. Most of that has now been eroded away. So unlike the moon, which is completely geologically dead, Mars does still have erosional processes which happen due to wind and water and dust. Whether there's a good comparison, it's hard to imagine because the biggest volcanoes on Earth are the ones, places like Hawaii, which stretch much further down below the sea, down to the sea floor than they do from the sea surface up to the into the atmosphere. But if you could come up with a comparison, that's probably the best way to understand them. Very gently sloping, very shallow hills, but enormously tall and supported by this enormous amount of mass.
Let me bring in some questions that are now flooding in, Ben, because they relate actually to a whole variety of aspects of what you said. Let me group a couple together in the same sort of area. I've got one from Bill on Facebook who asks, you say yours was the first deployment of a seismometer for 42 years. Could you tell us anything about the original one and what did that discover? But then that goes quite well with Jamie's question, which has come in on Twitter, which is, how long will your equipment last in that environment? And I suppose we have to ask, is there anything left as far as we know of the first probe? But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a series of excellent questions. I would actually start with where the first seismometer was deployed off of Earth. That was actually on the moon in 1969, and those instruments lasted about 7 years. After that, there were 2 attempts to deploy seismometers of the sort that we have on Earth. One was on Mars on the Viking missions in the 1970s. There were 2. One didn't deploy, and the other one on Viking 2, the seismometer was actually stuck on the leg of the lander. Now, you can imagine what happens if you're standing out in the wind and you have a seismometer or something, or a pendulum in your pocket. You shake in the wind, just a little bit, but it's enough that the seismometer also shakes. So the Viking seismometer proved to be an excellent wind sensor, but not a particularly good seismometer. So there was no unambiguous detection of a Mars quake achieved by Viking. The other example that was tried was on the Venera mission. So those were Soviet missions that went to Venus in the 1980s. They also didn't make any unambiguous detections, and they only lasted a matter of hours, less than 2 hours, because they melted under the enormous temperatures on Venus. Viking lasted a little longer, but there was no way of getting around this problem that it was just shaking in the wind and not able to detect Marsquakes. InSight doesn't have that problem. How long will it last? Well, it's actually a pretty dire situation at the moment. The solar panels are gradually getting covered in dust, and that reduces the amount of sunlight available to the solar panels. It means that we don't have enough power to power the instruments the way that we would like. So we're now getting close to the point where Mars is furthest from the sun, which has reduced the power even more. So we're in the process of shutting down the instruments. It's not clear yet whether we'll make it through the period that we call aphelion, so when we're furthest away from the sun. But it looks like there'll be a few months at the very least when there'll be no data available.
Fascinating. We've got, actually, I think one of your last comments just prompted Chris's question on Facebook, Ben, so I'll just segue right into that. That Mars weather that you're talking about, is that ever likely to change over time? And we've become very used to the idea of the long trajectory of climate change, both human formed and also as a natural phenomenon over billions of years. Does Mars have anything that's similar to that?
No, not really. So the Martian atmosphere and weather is extremely stable, and it repeats from year to year with some precision. So when we were planning the detection of Perseverance's landing, we used the data from the same time the previous Martian year, and we could say with some certainty that it would be identical. What does change every now and then is you get dust storms at a certain time of year. They cover the whole planet in dust. I mean, it's literally a global dust storm. The entire atmosphere is blacked out by dust. But those have been happening for quite some time. They will continue to happen for quite some time. On Earth, lots of the dynamics of the weather are affected by things like the ocean. On Earth, Mars doesn't have an ocean anymore. There's nothing to produce that kind of energy balance that we see. So yes, there's still weather. It's still windier sometimes than others. It depends how far away it is from the sun. It depends on the season, but there's no sort of big climatic change happening on Mars today the same way that there is on Earth.
So that might get to Neil's question that's coming on YouTube, which is, are there any changes that we're expecting to happen on Mars, or could we predict any from what we know?
Probably not anytime soon. The climate and the atmosphere on Mars are both very stable. As I said, on the short term, sometimes you get dust storms, but in the long term, we're not expecting the Martian climate to warm or cool substantially. There are long-term cycles to do with the orbits, so that's sorts of things that cause ice ages on Earth, and we might see similar things happening on Mars on the timescales of tens of thousands of years. But if it's a question about, is Mars's climate changing on a year to decade timescale the same way that Earth's is, the answer is no.
We've got a couple of questions that deal with something I think, again, fascinates us all. So let me try and group them together. But they all basically center on the question of whether or not there is any possibility of habitability. Brian C. on YouTube, could Mars ever be habitable? Another version of that, I think, is coming in from Ahmed on Facebook. Didn't Mars used to be a more habitable environment from what we can tell? Is that something that anyone is seriously thinking about?
So you're absolutely right that Mars was more habitable in the past. It looks like the entire northern hemisphere was probably covered by an ocean about 3 billion years ago. It looks like the magnetic dynamo that kept the magnetic field alive may have been more active in the past, keeping the atmosphere in place. So yes, 3 billion years ago, Mars probably wasn't enormously different from the way that Earth was. I mean, I didn't think I'd care to say that the atmosphere was nice and breathable and it was warm, but you could have made a living more easily there back then than you could now. Today, it's important to realize that Mars is far more inhospitable than the most inhospitable environment on Earth. It's far harsher than Antarctica or the summit of Everest or anything like that. The atmosphere is toxic, the soil is toxic, it's incredibly dry, there's very little to no liquid water available on the surface, and that which is there is incredibly saline. Could it be habitable one day? Well, yes. I mean, it's more habitable than, say, the environment that the International Space Station exists in. It's more habitable than deep space, but the ISS is close to Earth. It's not self-sustaining. We have to send up food and water and people. Mars doesn't have the capacity to do that at the moment. But if you were willing to invest the time and money and ship stuff from Earth, sure, there's no reason that you couldn't live there today. In the future, I think what people are getting at is, could Mars become more self-sustaining? People talk about things called terraforming, so that's changing the Martian climate. These things are all possible, but you're starting to talk on the century to millennium timescale now, rather than the year to decade.
So in other words, we don't think we're going to see sort of Earth colonies on Mars in the next 20, 30 years or anything of that sort?
Absolutely not. And you'd have to ask the question, what would be the advantage of doing that with the technology that we have? It'd be far easier to sort of move the colonies into the Sahara or something, some other incredibly inhospitable environment where at least there's oxygen and water.
Lisa on Facebook is asking, in terms of the wider field of research, how much have we still got to discover about Mars? Do we know 1%, 10%, a lot more than perhaps people popularly realize? What's your sense of that?
So we have a very good understanding of what the surface of Mars looks like from orbit. We've taken very high resolution pictures of the entire surface, just like we have of Earth. The question, though, is not just how is Mars today, it's how has Mars come to be the way that it is and what will it be like in the future? And again, we're talking on very long time scales here. How in the last 100 million years has the surface changed? How will it change in the next 10 million years? Those are questions that are still left to be answered, and they depend on all sorts of things. For example, how much does dust and wind cause erosion on Mars? How much does it cause landforms to change? How active is the Martian core? Is there still any residual tectonic activity, or is it all completely died away? So there's lots of things left to be explored. Many of the things that haven't been answered yet are questions that require looking below the surface or monitoring for very long periods of time, which is why a mission like InSight is so exciting.
That is something that I think really does fascinate people. We're getting quite a few questions here about the question about how one might expand the scope of the field. A question actually relates to that from Paolo, also coming on Facebook. In what way does knowledge of seismology on Mars maybe help us here on planet Earth? Are there any, I mean, it could be, the joy of the research is enough, and quite often that should be, but are there any senses in which there's practical applicability?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about the questions that you would want a seismologist most to answer, they're things like how and why do earthquakes happen, and how can we predict when they're going to happen? Or is it even possible to predict them when they're going to happen? Those are all very legitimate questions, and people spend a lot of time and money exploring them on Earth, but it's hard to draw big conclusions when you've only got one planet to study. So studying seismic processes on Mars is helping us to understand how the Earth's seismic processes came to be the way that they are. And in addition to that, we've had to develop all sorts of new technologies and ways of processing the signals that we get from Mars. Now, all of those can be applied to studying earthquakes on Earth. So although InSight is a Mars seismology mission, most of the people who work on it also study earthquakes or seismic or tectonic processes here on Earth. And there's lots of things that can be sort of applied across those two fields, but also into disciplines that are much more broad ranging.
Would that include things like predictability, or is it not quite in that sort of area?
So predictability is a really hard thing to do, and it's important to draw the distinction between forecasting and prediction. So it's just like the weather. You can forecast what the weather will be tomorrow. You cannot predict what the weather will be tomorrow. There's a difference. One is probabilistic, the other is deterministic. So you can say there's a 60% chance it's going to rain. I mean, it's England. It's probably a much higher chance than 60% that it's going to rain tomorrow. But you can't say it's a 100% certain it will rain at 9:12 tomorrow morning. It's the same with earthquakes, and you'll see people talking about this, especially in the context of places like California and Japan. It's reasonably certain there will be a large earthquake off the west coast of the United States at some point in the next 10 to 20 years. Exactly when that is, probably impossible to tell. But we can come to some sort of statistical description of that. So again, understanding how Mars works, understanding how different earthquakes occur in different settings on Mars and indeed on Earth is helping to inform those kinds of discussions and decisions.
I have to say, Ben, your assurance that it's going to be a very long time, probably outside our lifetimes, before we can actually end up going on EasyJet to Mars is not putting questioners off. So I'm going to just do one more, put together a couple of questions for one more round on this.
Sure.
This one's quite nicely put. Could you say more about how we would terraform Mars? Is it in any sense comparable to any human projects to date in terms of scale or feasibility? Or are we talking about something bigger than we've ever imagined, really?
Absolutely incomparable to anything that we've done before. Even by the fastest estimates, terraforming Mars would be a millennium-long project. Your children's children's children would not see the result. So it would have to be something that you're really committed to doing. At this point in time, there's a fair question to ask of, what is the point? We haven't been able to manage these tiny fluctuations in carbon dioxide levels in our own atmosphere. Why would we assume that we're capable of managing that sort of enormous fluctuation in Mars's atmosphere? We're not just talking about, on Earth, it would be enough to stop climate change to bring the CO2 level down from 450 parts per million to, 200, 300, something close to pre-industrial levels. On Mars, we're talking about increasing the atmospheric pressure from about 1%, that of Earth, to equal to that of Earth. The atmosphere is also almost entirely carbon dioxide, which you really don't want to be breathing in. So we're talking about completely replacing the entire atmosphere of Mars. The soil at the moment is also completely toxic. So you're talking about somehow either isolating yourself from the soil or coming up with a way of shielding from it. Mars doesn't have a magnetic field, which means it's completely exposed to the solar wind. So when you have stuff like coronal mass ejections, things that create beautiful northern lights on Earth, they actually become incredibly dangerous on Mars because there's nothing to protect you. So in terms of scale or feasibility, I mean, you could perhaps compare it to the advent of human civilization, if you like, something that's taken 10,000 years to go from developing the wheel and the first writing systems to developing a civilization that can put people into space. It's not something that has any comparison to a single project where we've known where we're going. There's nothing in the past where we've set ourselves a goal, anything close to that, like that.
I'm smiling, Ben, because on the chat is coming up. The question has replied. So it's not a no. Then I will. We'll perhaps leave that there. But just to say that there have been also a couple of questions which perhaps follow up on the hugely ambitious, but perhaps less ambitious question, which is, but could someone visit Mars in some sort of feasible, imagined project within the next number of decades, say?
Yes, and I suspect that will happen. It will be expensive. It will take a long time. You could kind of do it with today's technology, but it would be extremely inefficient. So yes, someone of my generation, perhaps someone of the generation younger than me, almost certainly I would suspect. But again, this is not the sort of thing that just happens by default. We've been talking about landing on Mars in the next 10 years for the last 50 years. It's always been 10 to 20 years away. And one of the reasons for that is that getting public support for this sort of thing is challenging. So if people ever want to know what they can do to support Mars research, ensuring that there's strong public support for everything to do with Mars is a vital part of that. The work that InSight and Perseverance and Curiosity are doing right now is setting the foundations for people visiting Mars one day in the future.
That's all wonderful stuff, Ben. I'm conscious from the questions that we could keep you here for ages, but we know that you've got to get back to the lab. So let me finish with a question that is really about what comes next. And the way I put it is that we've heard an awful lot about the wonderful things that you have discovered. What is it that you know that is coming up as the next part of the research agenda that you don't know yet, but you'd like to know and you think you will know if we were to have you back? I hope you will in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years.
I suspect that the answer to that question will change in 2 or 3 years because we'll end up seeing something we never expected to see. I would say that at the moment, from an insight point of view, understanding why Mars quakes are the way they are, why are they so different to what we see here on Earth, and what can that tell us about the interior of Mars? I think that will and will continue to be a big research topic within our team, and one which has clear implications to understanding earthquakes on Earth as well. What exactly that answer will be, guess you'll have to check back in a while.
In that case, that's an invitation, I think, Ben, to have you back sooner rather than later. But it's a real pleasure to have had award-winning physicist Ben Fernando here to tell us about the seismology of Mars. And I think that there's plenty more that will be picked up by our audience, inspired by what you have to say. So thank you so much for joining us on that. And thank you for our audience for Oxford at Home from around the world who have joined us today. And this is to remind you that we'll be back one more time at the very end of our Oxford Hillary term, as we call it, the spring term here at the university. And you may recognize the speaker for next week because I have to confess it is in fact me. I'll be switching hats from host to speaker, talking on the subject of China's good war. And if I hope that sounds intriguing, it's subtitled How World War II is Creating a New Nationalism Now. So if you want to know how those parts come together, please do join us at the usual time, which is 12:45 GMT here in the UK for about half an hour. And if you're wondering who's hosting, that's an extra special surprise and you'll have to find out. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining us